Okay, so here's the cross on the doctor.
All right. So I just want to kind of review a few things with you, sir. I don't think we'll take too long, but so you were ultimately approached by the state of Minnesota to assist them in the review of the medical issues in this case, correct?
Correct.
And you have volunteered to do this work at no cost, correct?
Correct.
And that's, you're not normally involved in criminal cases of this nature, correct?
Correct.
And this is the first time you've ever been involved in a criminal case, correct?
Correct.
And it was that reason that you decided not to
He's talking
charge a
fast
fee?
because I got him sped up.
Correct.
Now, when you are in other cases, what type of fee do you normally charge?
I charge per hour, so it's.
What's your hourly rate?
And my hourly rate is $500 an hour for reviewing material.
Okay. But you agreed to waive your hourly rate for this time, correct? You
Social
felt it was
justice.
an important case, right?
Yes.
All right. Now, in preparation for your testimony today, you met with the state numerous times, correct?
Correct.
You have had the opportunity to review all of the medical information that was obtained in this case, correct?
Yes.
That would include Mr. Floyd's previous medical history, correct?
Correct.
The autopsy and attending toxicology reports that were prepared in this case?
Yes.
He really wants to hit that autopsy report hard because they said the fentanyl killed him.
As well as some investigative materials, police reports, things of that nature, correct?
Correct.
And just correct me if I'm wrong, but you're not a pathologist, correct?
Correct. I am not a pathologist.
Your specialty is in pulmonology, critical care, things of that nature.
Correct.
And then you also have an interest and an impressive resume relevant to applied physiology as well.
Correct.
And you've been honored quite extensively for your work in that regard, right?
Correct.
You're not a Minneapolis police officer.
Correct.
It's fair to say that the training that is provided by the Minneapolis Police Department in terms of medical care comes nowhere close to your level of expertise.
Correct.
A great follow-up question there is, are you aware that officers have to be judged on their training and experience and totality of circumstances, not just from the medical perspective?
You understand that Minneapolis police officers are not even EMTs.
Correct.
They have a basic life-saving certificate dealing with gunshots, chest seals, tourniquets, and CPR, right?
Yes.
Right. So you've also had the opportunity to review a lot of the body camera footage, correct?
Yes.
You've done, I think you testified that you've watched these videos hundreds of times.
Correct.
And you've watched them all from...
That's a lot of $500 an hour that he's waiving just to be here. I mean, that he didn't ask him, why did you waive your fee for this? And why is this such an important trial? Because he probably would have went the social justice route.
all different angles, correct?
Correct.
And you've had the luxury of slowing things down, moving it into slow motion, still framing various times, right?
Correct.
And so your analysis of this case comes after hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of time spent looking at this information.
I don't know the total amount of time that I've spent, but it's substantial.
Right. So then you ultimately, based on the review of all of that, you prepared a report, correct?
Correct.
And you provided that to the state of Minnesota in late January of this year, right?
January 27, yeah.
Right. And after that, you've had numerous meetings with the prosecution team in this case?
By phone or by Zoom, yeah.
Right. Including January 30th of this year?
I don't know the dates, but I mean, that sounds correct.
Right. So if I were to tell you the dates were January 30th, March 3rd, March 9th, March 17th, March 21st, April 6th, and
Oh
April
my
7th,
God!
you would not have any reason to dispute me.
I have no reason to.
You think he was getting coached a little bit?
And you understand that notes are made of those meetings and provided to the defense in this case, correct?
I understood that.
Yep. And then you've also been able to spend a substantial period of time preparing the exhibits that the jury was able to see earlier today, right?
Correct.
And those were all prepared by you or someone within your team, right?
They're prepared by me. Yeah.
And you provided those to the prosecution in advance of today's testimony?
Correct.
And do you understand those were provided to me last night?
I have no idea when. But,
Okay.
Yep.
So the prosecution had him all this time and gave it to him last night. That's bullshit.
All right. So you've had a lot of time to prepare both yourself as well as the prosecution team in connection with this case. Fair to say?
Correct.
Now, you talked quite a bit about physics in your direct testimony. Agreed?
Yes.
And you would agree that physics, or the application of physical forces, is a constantly changing set of circumstances.
I didn't catch what you said.
Sure. You would agree with me, would you not, that when you look at the concepts of physics, these things are constantly changing, right?
Yeah, all science is constant changing.
Constant. I mean,
Yes.
in milliseconds and nanoseconds, right?
Yes.
And so if I put this much weight or this much weight, all of the formulas and variations will change from second to second, millisecond to millisecond, nanosecond to nanosecond. Agreed?
I agree.
Similarly, biology sort of works the same way, right?
Yes.
My heart beats, my lungs breathe, my brain is sending millions of signals to my body at all times.
Correct.
Again, faster than the speed of light, right?
Correct.
Millions of signals every nanosecond, right?
Yes.
And I think in your report, you even kind of discuss that when you're talking about these instances, when you're talking about the physics or the biology, what you're really talking about is a single kind of nanosecond. But all of these processes are working in concert at all times, right?
Right. I mean, the way we calculate it is the mean value, but I mean, it's then into one instant.
Right. You've taken this case and you've literally
Fun fact, speed of light, 186,000 miles per second.
boiled it down into a nanosecond.
Oh, I wouldn't say that, no, because it's obviously in my report, as you see, it's sequentially, there's a whole chronology. I begin from the time the knee is placed on the neck, and then all the time until what's happening in Hennepin County ER.
Right. And so your report talks about the sequential nature of things, but when we talk about the biology and the physics of this case, these things are working simultaneously, contemporaneously, all together, right?
That's correct.
In an incredibly rapid fashion.
Yes.
And you would agree with me that as this incident was occurring, there was nobody measuring the units of force that were placed on any particular position of any particular person at any particular moment, right?
Correct.
I mean, there was nobody there measuring them at the time. I agree that, but they're all calculable.
Understood. And that's when you calculate them, what you have to do is you have to boil it down into what you would call the mean or the average, right?
Correct.
And so whenever we look at the concept of an average, there are things that are happening moments before, moments after, right?
Yes.
And forces will increase or decrease relative to the nanosecond of time. Agreed?
Correct. Yep.
He's making some good points. I really like this attorney.
And ultimately, when we talk about kind of the biology of things, a pathologist tries to look at all the intersection of all of the things that occur to in a particular death investigation, correct?
But I mean, they're not looking at anything to do physiology.
Understood. But they're also looking at how other factors may contribute to the death
Or a combination of factors.
of an individual, right?
I mean, they're basically
It's a yes or
looking.
no, sir.
Sorry?
It's a yes or no, sir, so I'm objecting.
Well, yes, partly.
They're looking at things beyond.
See, when he said yes, partly, the prosecution just made a note and said, I need to come back and let him finish that and explain that. So you can expect a question on this from the prosecution when he gets his cross or his recross.
A nanosecond. Agreed?
No, I mean, I think In terms of a pathologist, they're looking at a nanosecond. They're looking at the nanosecond of death.
Right. But they're taking into consideration things simply that extend beyond physiology, right?
I mean, they're looking primarily at pathology.
Right. So what causes the heart to stop? What causes the lungs to cease to function, etc., right?
I mean, they're making an inference based on a pathological time point.
Right. Considering a multitude of biological factors that are involved in the death of a person, right?
I mean, it's the same as any physician is looking at a multitude of factors.
Not you.
So in terms, again, of your review, you would agree that the amount of time that you've spent looking at videos, analyzing these videos from different perspectives and angles is far greater than the length of this incident.
Yes.
Probably to the times 1,000.
I can't. I really don't know. But I mean, but it's substantially longer than the incident.
Which is exactly
And
why
ultimately you conclude,
which is why the Supreme Court says it should not be viewed in a vacuum, and cops should have a wide breadth or an umbrella of protection, because they're making all of these things at a split-second decision, and they aren't doctors. And their safety is above someone's medical condition. If a guy's shooting at me and he might have a heart attack, I don't really care about his heart attack. I don't want to get killed by the guy shooting at me. So it's easy for doctors in comfort to make this seem like, oh, absolutely, it was this, it was that, it was this, we got it all figured out, we know all the answers. Well, you know what? They ain't a whole bunch of doctors running around saying who got killed and why they were shot 14 times and which bullet killed it, and was it the third one or the fourth one or the fifth one?
Mr. Floyd died as what we would call a hypoxic death.
He died of a low level of oxygen.
Right. That there was a low level of oxygen that caused damage to the brain, which resulted in a pulseless electrical activity, correct?
Not quite.
How did you phrase it?
He had a low level of oxygen that caused damage to the brain. The brain didn't cause the pulses electrical alternance. The low level of oxygen caused both. The low level of oxygen caused the damage to the brain. The low level of oxygen separately caused the pulses electrical alternance.
So it's an example of how multiple processes are occurring simultaneously.
Well, not really. It's just one process. It's a low level of oxygen that's doing both.
That's having an effect on multiple, the heart and the brain and the lungs, right?
Not really. It's just two.
Okay.
The brain and the heart.
The brain and the heart. All right. Now you talked about, I think you called it is it the nuchal ligament?
Yes.
Am I saying that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Right. That's that space at the back of the neck that's very, very hard, right?
It's not so much a space. I mean, it's a long bit, but it's roughly the palm of your hand. You stick the palm of your hand at the back of your neck,
Right.
and you're right over the nuchal ligament.
Right. And that's you said a very, very hard surface, right?
Yeah.
Can withstand a great amount of pressure, right?
Correct.
And so when we talk about the placement of the knee, there would be periods of time where Mr. Chauvin's knee was placed at that nuchal ligament, based on your observation of the
Yes.
videos.
Let's try and not talk over each other. and that
I'm
goes-
sorry.
Nope, that goes both ways.
And you've had an opportunity to review the autopsy, correct?
I did. Yeah.
Right. You understand that there was no bruising either atop the skin or under the skin surfaces that were noted by Dr. Baker.
Yes, I'm aware.
And you also are aware, you talked quite a bit about the hypopharynx, right?
Yes.
I would have probably followed up with that. You said it was 90 pounds of pressure. If I dropped a 90-pound weight on you, would you think it would bruise you or not? Because you just said there was 90 pounds of force that he was putting, yet there was no bruising.
You're aware that the hypopharynx was photographed at autopsy and no injury was noted.
I'm aware.
Now, I found it very interesting in your testimony, in your report, when you're kind of talking about this notion of if you can't speak, or if you can speak, it doesn't mean you can, or, sorry, I have to say, if you can speak, you can breathe,
Yes.
right? And you described this as a very dangerous proposition, right?
Yes. Yes.
You described this as causing a false sense of security to people, right? That's how you
Correct. Yep.
And in fact, in your report, you actually write a paragraph about how physicians oftentimes have trouble with this, right?
Yes.
And so people who've, similar to yourself, attended medical school, right? Sorry, you have to say yes.
I'm sorry, terribly sorry.
No
Yeah.
problem.
Yes.
So, intelligent men and women who've graduated from college, gone on to medical school, and are engaged in the practice of medicine sometimes have problems with this notion, right?
Yes.
A patient comes in and says that they're having trouble breathing, and oftentimes a physician will not believe them, essentially.
It's important, Mr. Nelson, to make sure we're talking about speech or difficulty in breathing, because they're different.
Right. Well, you write in your report that some doctors incorrectly consider patients to be hysterical.
Your Honor, may we approach? Let's see this, Jones.
Your Honor, the reference to the report is hearsay. It's not evidence. It's not proper. Overruling from it.
Overruled.
So he wanted him to say, do you recall in your report stating, if I told you said this, would it refresh your recollection? And the judge said, I'm not playing that, just answer.
You wrote in your report that some doctors incorrectly consider patients hysterical and the symptoms imaginary in nature, which further aggregates patient distress, right?
Yes. Yes, I recall.
And you wrote that this view represents a physician's failure to understand the fundamental cause of a clinical disorder.
Right, but I'm talking about a different thing there. That's hyperventilation syndrome,
So somebody
which
comes
is
in.
very different than the difficulty with speech. They're really apples and oranges.
Okay. But if physicians, right, someone comes in and they're
Yeah.
hyperventilating and they articulate to their physician,
Yes.
I can't breathe,
Yes.
right? And it's hyperventilation syndrome, right?
Yes.
And physicians oftentimes, as you indicate,
Yes.
confuse this issue.
Correct.
They blame the patient, right? Or
I don't have to blame the patient, but I mean, they certainly missed the diagnosis.
And it's a kind of when we're talking about speaking and breathing simultaneously,
Yes.
which is a different consideration. If a Minneapolis police lieutenant who trains police officers happened to have testified that that's a common statement in the course of treatment or in the course of training of Minneapolis police officers, you might take exception with that statement.
I didn't follow your question.
I'm sorry.
It's very hard to hear through that plexiglass.
And I'm losing my voice, I think. Excuse me.
I would ask it in a way that, are you aware that the Minneapolis Police Department teaches that phrase to their officers? If they can talk, they can breathe.
A Minneapolis police officer,
Yeah.
I'll try to talk closer to the mic.
Mm-hmm.
The Minneapolis police lieutenant who trains Minneapolis police officers testified that it is frequently said and trained to police officers that a person can talk, it means they can breathe. You would have a problem with that.
Yes, I mean, they're able to breathe at that moment in time, but 10 seconds later, they may be dead.
Right. And because dealing with any person is a rapidly evolving situation that can change from second to second.
Yes.
Now, in terms of the calculations that you've made, you would agree that your calculations are generally theoretical, correct?
No, they're not theoretical. I mean, they're based on direct measurements. They're based on extensive research.
But you're making certain assumptions in the application of that science, are you not?
Very few assumptions.
Very few. Oh, shit. Well, shit, I'm sorry. I thought you were making a lot of assumptions. Just very few assumptions to say that something is very scientific yet you're saying you're making assumptions. Oh, that makes perfect sense. Jesus Christ, dude.
You're assuming the weight of Mr. Chauvin.
Right, I'm aware. So, I mean, obviously, I'm aware that there's two different weights that are given.
And you're assuming the weight of the equipment that the officer wears.
Yes,
And you've not actually ever physically measured the weight of the equipment a police officer carries, correct?
no. I mean, I took the measurements that are reported.
And you're not actually weighing what Mr. Chauvin weighed on May 25th of 2020.
No.
And in your measurements, you appear to be, at least from my understanding, which is going to be limited, but from my understanding, is that your measurements assumed an equal weight distribution between the right and the left legs.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. And so again, as we know, as things change and evolve and flow,
And movement and resistance from the suspect and other officers and cars speeding by and pulling the mace and putting the mace away and looking, even me moving my head will cause a shift in weight and weight distribution.
that's weight is pretty frequently redistributed, right?
That is correct.
And again,
Since he can ask him for an opinion, I would say, what's your opinion? Why do you think in the autopsy they said fentanyl killed him and there was no bruising to lead to what you're saying? Why do you think that's different? I'd have him explain that.
again, in terms of the EELV, am I saying
Yes.
that right? The EELV, that's the, can you?
And expiratory lung volume.
All right. You're also basing that those calculations on the presumption that a person is a healthy individual, right?
For the ELV, it's not going to change, really.
But in terms of the normal respiratory rates, some of the other factors that you put into your analysis, it's all premised upon a healthy individual, right?
Right. It's based on a 46-year-old person of a particular height and sex. Yes.
Who's healthy.
Correct.
Man, he had to pull that out of him. Good grief. When you got to pull something out of a witness, he denies, gives you alternate answers, and then finally agrees, we call that a clue.
And so you would agree, if biology can change rapidly, that the specific biological conditions of Mr. Chauvin and or Mr. Floyd come into play, right?
Correct.
And those volumes or those figures that you've assessed in connection with this case, they are conditioned upon him being a healthy individual.
Right. I mean, it varies in terms of the lungs. I mean, say, for example, compliance will vary, but end expiratory lung volume is pretty robust. It just isn't going to vary.
Okay, so but other factors, like you said, what was the first sentence?
Lung compliance will vary from one person to the next person, but it varies different segments within the lung. They're not all monolithic.
Okay. Now, and you talked about one thing in terms of, and this is a little bit of an aside, in terms of the prone position and the pushing of the stomach into the lungs, right?
Yes.
The size of a person's stomach has some bearing on that, right?
It does.
How do people sleep on their stomach if that's a critical factor?
Person like myself who has a few extra inches, if I'm prone, it's going to perhaps push further or harder up into my lungs, right?
Yes.
A person who is healthy, physical, muscular, it's going to have less of an impact.
That is correct.
George Floyd was muscular and in shape.
All right. But again, in terms of what we have learned about Mr. Floyd from his autopsy and his medical records, is that we understand that Mr. Floyd had some heart disease, right?
That is correct.
In fact, I believe that he had in some of his arteries somewhere
75%.
between a 75 and 90% occlusion of his ventricular arteries, right?
Correct.
And that's going to affect blood flow in a person, right? It's going to make the body work a little harder to get the blood through the body.
No, not really. It's not going to do that.
Okay. How does that affect a person's respiratory?
The coronary artery?
Mm-hmm.
If the coronary artery is affecting it, and if the coronary artery was contributing to shortness of breath, you would expect that he would be complaining of chest pain, and you would expect that he would be demonstrating a very rapid respiratory rate. We don't see either.
Okay. We'll come back to the respiration. I can't say it right. I'm taken by your accent. The respiratory rate.
I can't compensate for it.
Appreciate it. I'll say it like you, his respiratory rate.
Okay. There you go.
All right. We also understand that Mr. Floyd, based on his medical records, has a history of hypertension or high blood pressure.
Yes, that's correct.
High blood pressure, 75 to 90% blockage, pumping 11 times more fentanyl than the body should take, using methamphetamine, fighting with the cops, and then eating drugs. No, Rick, it was the knee. Okay.
Now, in terms of, we also understand that Mr. Floyd had previously been diagnosed with COVID-19, right?
Correct.
And he may not be have been symptomatic on March 25th, but it's fair to say that a lot is unknown about the effects of COVID-19 on a person's lungs, long term.
I mean, not as much as it would appear to be the case. I mean, because obviously it's a viral illness. We have a huge amount of information about the long-term effects of viral illnesses.
And those can affect the elasticity of the lungs, right?
Not the elasticity. It would be, if it's having any effect, it would be within the sensory receptors within the tracheobronchial 3. So it really wouldn't have anything to do with the elasticity.
Okay. Now, but we also...
This doctor is good when he tries to make a medical conclusion. The doctor is good at slamming him and refocusing that he doesn't know what he's talking about, and then he throws out the proper terms. So, as the attorney, he needs to be asking more how he would describe it instead of trying to describe it himself, so this doctor can't throw it back in his face.
Learned quite a bit about the toxicology as well. Oh, excuse me. On the COVID-19, you testified that treatment of people with COVID-19 includes leaving them in the prone position, right?
Correct.
And so those people who would be treated for COVID-19 in the prone position, based on your calculations, you would have a 24% decrease in the EELV.
Right. I mean, this is people with COVID, where they're during the time that they have COVID.
Right. But that's what you'd expect, that same decrease in the EELV.
No, it's going to be very different. In somebody who has, say, pneumonia, what's going to happen in the prone position will be very variable from one person to another as a result of the pneumonia. It's different than normal lungs.
Okay. So in essence, every person is different.
Oh, for certain.
And now...
So he just turned that around and went, you know what, I'm not going to argue with you, but you kind of made my point that it's not in a vacuum, and you're looking at him as a healthy guy, and he wasn't a healthy guy.
You calculated his respiratory rate to be 22, right?
Correct.
And you said that was within the normal respiratory rate?
Yep.
And you would not describe him as hyperventilating?
The word hyperventilation is open to an awful lot of misinterpretation. That is most certainly not hyperventilation. No.
And hyperventilation assists in the removal of carbon dioxide from the body, right?
It's confusing. It's not that simple.
In its simplest terms.
In the simplest terms, yes, it does assist. It gets rid of carbon dioxide.
All right.
But
Now,
it can.
Jeez, man, this guy's he's going to argue. Well, it's not really pink. It's actually fusion with a little bit of coral and a little bit of red, but essentially it's pink. Really?
And being frequently misleading.
Okay. Now, in terms of the toxicology of Mr. Floyd, we did learn that there were some controlled substances in his system, right?
Yes.
We know that there was, for example, nicotine, right?
Yes.
Mr. Floyd was a smoker.
Correct.
And
Oh my God, he was a smoker with all that too? Holy shit. Drugs, smoking, methamphetamine, fentanyl, 75%, 90% heart blockage, high blood pressure. He's fighting with the cops and he's eating dope. No, Rick, it was the knee. Okay, I got it.
Smoking changes the lung function. Agreed?
In some people.
Now, we also learned more, and I'm not suggesting that all people who smoke have lung problems, right?
Less than 10% do. 90% don't have any.
A little bit from the microphone. Sorry.
Wow, did he just say 90% don't have any that smoke? Wow.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
So you focused in your direct examination quite a bit in terms of fentanyl and the fentanyl's effect on the respiration rate.
Yes.
And you would agree generally that fentanyl is a respiratory depressant.
It can be.
Can be. I thought that's exactly what it was designed for. Pain and
It's used in operating rooms, right?
Yes, for yeah,
And it's also used in the management of chronic pain, right?
that is correct.
And medically speaking, those are really the only two reasons that fentanyl would be prescribed.
Yes, probably.
But you understand that fentanyl has become far more prolific in street drugs, right?
Yes, I'm aware.
And you would agree generally that there is a significant difference between fentanyl that's manufactured according to the United States, their whatever
FDA.
rules apply, right? The pharmaceutical companies make it much differently than the street dealers do, right?
I imagine so.
Right. And so when a person is ingesting illicit street purchased fentanyl, it's every time they take a fentanyl dose, it's a different experience for that person.
Right, but
not only a different experience, it's a different combination. You don't know what the cutting agent, you don't know the strength, you don't know if it was a good batch, a bad batch, a mixed batch, or nothing.
if it's affecting the respiratory center, it's going to act through the mu receptors in the medulla oblongata. There's no way around that.
Right.
It's not. Fentanyl isn't going to have an effect on respiration by some other mechanism.
Understood. But the end result of fentanyl can include respiratory depression.
Right, through the mu receptors.
Right. And we also learned that there was methamphetamine in a low dose in Mr. Floyd's system, right?
Correct.
And the fentanyl and the methamphetamine, they can kind of counteract each other, right?
Well, I mean, they're up and downers, but in terms of the respiratory centers, there's not going to be.
So the methamphetamine would not, the methamphetamine is going to increase the heart rate, right?
That's a different thing than the respiratory centers. yeah.
Understood. But methamphetamine will increase a person's heart rate, right?
Yes.
When you increase the heart rate, normally your breath rate and respiration goes up, and so does your blood pressure.
That's one of the side effects.
Yes.
And there are a few there are a few conditions where a physician can lawfully prescribe methamphetamine, right?
Yes.
But it's exceedingly rare that it's actually done.
I can't say, but I mean, it's definitely a prescribable agent. Kind of, it used to be used commonly for appetite suppressant.
And
To lose weight. My buddy was on it. He called. He goes, man, I got these pills of methamphetamine from my doctor. I'm dropping weight like crazy.
I think ADHD, is that
Yes.
right?
yes.
I'm not taking those pills. My buddy took them years ago.
So and adrenaline can be put into the body in multiple ways, right? Well, let me. There are many things that can cause a surge in adrenaline.
Yes.
One of those things would be getting into a fight with someone
Yes.
or being afraid.
Difficult to know in terms of being afraid,
Fight or flight absolutely causes an adrenaline dump.
but getting into a fight.
And the paraganglionoma that was found, I understand you call it the 10% tumor, but in 10% of the tumor cases that can cause an adrenaline surge.
Yes, and in the 90% it won't.
Now,
And of those 90%, what if the guy has a blocked heart, 90%, high blood pressure, taking 2 different drugs, etc.? Does that matter? No. This doctor will not throw this guy a bone on any question.
in terms of the use of fentanyl in the hospital setting, surgical setting, have you become familiar with what's called wooden chest syndrome?
Yes, I have.
And can you explain for the jury what wooden
I
chest
mean,
syndrome
in
is?
some patients with fentanyl, you'll get an increase in chest wall stiffness.
So the lungs become less elastic?
Not quite the lungs, the chest wall.
Okay, so that would prevent a chest wall tight or chest wall rigidity will also decrease the performance of the lungs.
It will impede the ability of the lungs to expand.
Now, in your report, you wrote that you would expect the peak respiratory depression to occur from fentanyl within 5 minutes of ingestion.
Right?
And
But you don't know how much he ingested or when, do you?
have you come to learn that tablets were found or controlled substances were found in the backseat of Squad 320?
I mean, I've heard reports to that effect. I don't know what the status of it is.
So you've not been provided with any additional information since the time you've prepared your report?
I'm sure that's wrong, but I've been provided with a lot of information. I don't necessarily recall, keep it all
Sure.
at the front of my brain.
Okay. Well, yesterday we heard testimony from the State Crime Lab that there were in the backseat of the squad car 2 partially consumed pills found in the back of Squad 320.
Objection, Your Honor, to the characterization of testimony.
Ah, I knew that was coming. Anytime you say what was testified to, an attorney will say you said it wrong.
To the characterization of...
Overruled, if it's foundational to your
It is. You understand that?
No, I said, I kind of, but not fully.
Yesterday, a chemist from the State Crime Lab
Okay.
testified in this case.
Counsel, I'm going to reverse my ruling.
It's a stain. You can state in the form of a hypothetical, however.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. I can't hear you.
The sidebar.
Okay, so the reason why he's going hoarse is sometimes I go hoarse doing a 3-hour live show. I'm getting a little... When you talk consistently for a long time, you're going to go hoarse. He's not just talking in here. He's talking to his client. He's on the phone with experts. He's planning his defense when he gets to put on his defense. He's talking with other lawyers. He's getting input from other people. And, I mean, when he's doing a trial like this, his phone's getting blown up, and he is talking 24/7. That's why he's losing his voice. Long trial.
Let me ask you in the form of a hypothetical question. Okay? If partially ingested pills that were determined to contain
The DNA.
both fentanyl and methamphetamine were found partially ingested in the backseat of the squad car, and that those pills had the DNA of the deceased individual on them, meaning that they took them, and those pills would have been in his mouth at about 2018, right? Is it fair to say that you would expect the peak fentanyl respiratory depression within about 5 minutes?
Right. I mean, obviously, it would depend on how much of it was ingested. I mean, just finding the pills won't tell you anything about whether any of it was ingested or some of it or anything.
Actually, his DNA was on it, so it was probably in his mouth. And because he had 11 milligrams, we know he ingested that much, or he added to that because of the tox in the autopsy.
But if there was any amount of it ingested, yes, the peak would be 5 minutes.
Right. And so if it happened at 2018 or thereabouts, when the individual was in the back of the car, you would expect that peak respiratory depression to be around 2013, right? 2023, I'm sorry. 2018 to 2023 is...
You're trying to really confuse me, Mr. Nelson.
I'm sorry. I think I can actually say it's been a long week now. So 2018 is the ingestion point. You would expect peak respiratory depression by 2023.
Correct.
Right? That's the peak, meaning that it could continue afterwards, right?
Right.
All right.
Oh, great point.
You also described in your direct testimony...
Every time he gets the prosecution witness to agree with him, that's a note that he can later put in front of the jury or use again during his defense or in his closing arguments. So that's really key, and he's really good about getting these witnesses to agree with him.
what you have interpreted...
Not that it's a trick. I mean, he's asking good questions in order to make it hard for them to disagree, and by them agreeing, he's building his defense.
to be an anoxic seizure, right?
Yes.
At 2024.
Correct. 24, 21.
2024.
21.
21. And that was in what you saw and what the jury was played was reflected in from Officer Lane's body camera, right?
Correct.
And it was the kick of the legs, right?
Yes.
And after that point, you can see Officer Lane hold the leg down, right?
Yes.
And you can see it kick up again,
Yes.
right?
Let's not go over each other.
Sorry.
Also, he should have added in there. So you would agree that if he peaked at 23, 1 minute later at 24 would be consistent with the peak of the respiratory failure or whatever term he was using.
A tendency to go fast. That's what you recognize based on your 46 years of being a pulmonologist and an intensivist and your experience, right?
Right. I mean, obviously there was additional information from the hand, but I mean, the leg was the key.
Right. And would be reasonable for a police officer to interpret that same behavior as resistance.
Objection, Your Honor. Foundation of witness to talk about what's reasonable for a police officer.
I think that's going to be sustained because he can't say what a reasonable officer would do or not know without knowing what officer, etc. I don't think that's going to fly, but we'll see.
Objection, Your Honor. Foundation of witness to talk about what's reasonable for a police officer.
Sustained.
Now,
Oh,
you testified that
If that's
the
for foundation.
last breath of Mr. Floyd was at 20, 25, 16, right?
Correct.
Prior to that point, to all people who were there and monitoring him, he would have appeared to have been breathing, right?
It's just hard for me to hear.
Sorry. Prior to that point,
Yeah?
it would be reasonable that he would appear to be breathing, right?
Yes.
Does nobody have a volume for these microphones? Maybe I got to make another suggestion because I told them to move the damn microphone on the side of the jury so people could look at the jury and talk into the microphone at the same time. Maybe somebody now needs to figure out if there's a volume on these microphones that you can turn them up and down, or the speakers.
And in fact, you showed us a segment where you were able to count his respiratory rates,
Yes.
right? And then you said that at 20, 35, and 06 seconds is when the first air was pumped back into him.
Correct.
All right. And you understand that paramedics arrived at 20, 27, and 45 seconds?
Yes.
And so the time between when the paramedics arrived and Mr. Floyd got his first air was roughly 8 minutes, almost 9 minutes.
Yes. Yeah.
And according to timelines, the drive to the hospital is about 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Were you aware that the drive to the hospital is about 5 minutes?
I wasn't aware, but I have no reason to dispute it.
And so between 20, 27, and 45 seconds when the EMTs first arrived and the time they got him to have an air in his lungs, that was a crucial 9 minutes.
Yes.
Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Mr. Blackwell.
Now, I think he could have made some points by saying, thank you for your testimony, or thank you. Maybe he didn't want to appear that this guy helped him or give him credibility, but, I've seen attorneys or DAs or prosecutors, thank a witness after they're done to kind of make it look like it so wasn't confrontational, but he kind of stopped pretty abrupt, but his throat's kind of giving him a problem. He wants to stop talking. And here comes damage control from the government. How can I undo and let this guy rattle and talk about anything he wants?
Dr. Tobin, just a few questions, just for clarification.
It ain't going to be a few. I'll bet who thinks, raise your hand if you think a few he's going to have a few questions. Few is 3, I think. Several is 3 or more. I may have to look that up.
Site. You would just ask a lot of questions about science and medicine, changing, constantly changing, evolving by the nanosecond, by the millisecond. You heard all of that.
Yes, I did.
I want to go to the period of time when Mr. Chauvin was on the back and neck of Mr. Floyd.
Yes.
Did you see him get off of the back of Mr. Floyd by the nanosecond, by the millisecond, by any seconds in the 9 minutes and 29 seconds that you saw him on?
No, I did not.
If you look at the 5 minutes and 3 seconds that you focused on, where, if you consider all the nanoseconds and milliseconds in the 5 minutes and 3 seconds, where was Mr. Chauvin the vast majority of that time?
He was on Mr. Floyd's neck and on his back and arm.
Right, not constantly changing.
No.
Now, you were asked questions about what injuries were noted on autopsy.
Yes,
And I think reference was made, there was no injury noted to the hypopharynx on autopsy.
correct.
Does that make any difference to you whatsoever?
None whatsoever. I wouldn't expect there to be anything found there
And why
at
not?
autopsy.
Why not, Dr. Dolan?
Because the effects on the hypopharynx are not something that is going to remain at the time of an autopsy. I mean, the type of changes that we see, say, in somebody with sleep apnea, that's not something you're going to see the following morning when you look at somebody. It's just not there.
Well, there was also a reference made to the absence of bruising on the neck during autopsy.
Yes.
Does that make any difference to you whatsoever?
No, because obviously whenever I go to church, I sit on a hard bench. I don't get bruising of my buttocks when I leave. So I wouldn't expect anything in terms of that. So if you have somebody, this was a static force. It's not as if somebody is jamming against it. So you wouldn't expect anything in the way of bruising.
And scientifically, do you know of any
Actually, I thought he did say jamming. Didn't he say jamming his knee? What was that term he was using? Forcing his knee into his side or something.
correlation?
Jamming against it. So you wouldn't expect anything in the way of bruising.
And scientifically, do you know of any correlation between the presence or absence of bruising on autopsy and the forces necessary to restrict breathing?
No, they're totally different because it's in terms of static forces and dynamic.
So are you telling me the defense needs to come back now and say, are you telling me static force can't bruise? If I stand on somebody, an old person who's got poor circulation or poor veins, are you telling me that's not going to bruise them? And if a large person or if I take a stick and put it on somebody's back and then put all my weight on that stick, are you telling me that's not going to bruise and burst blood vessels? Yet you're saying he used 90 pounds of force, and you're saying that's not going to... 90 pounds of force on a small area such as his knee and on a small area of his back and neck, and you're saying that's not going to cause bruising. Man.
What about low oxygen? If somebody suffers or dies from low oxygen,
Yes.
does that show up on autopsy?
No, it does not.
And the
Just so you know, we're already at 10 questions. I got a few questions. We're already at 10.
fact that it doesn't, does that mean anything to you whatsoever?
It has no meaning.
And why not?
Because low oxygen is a functional thing, just like an arrhythmia is a functional thing. It doesn't leave a fingerprint on the autopsy. It's just there. It's something that happened. But it won't leave any fingerprint afterwards. You don't see it.
But doesn't mean that the person didn't die from low oxygen.
No, absolutely not. So if you take somebody and you suffocate him with a pillow, and it's very clear to you after you suffocated the person and he's dead from the pillow, you're not going to see the effects of the low oxygen.
Now, you were asked quite a few questions about Mr. Floyd's pre-existing health conditions.
Correct.
And remember, he cited a number of those.
Yes.
Do any of those conditions have anything to do with the cause of Mr. Floyd's death, in your professional opinion, whatsoever?
None whatsoever.
Oh my God, are you serious? Did he just answer? Oh my God. This dude had 90% blockage in his heart. He had methamphetamine, fentanyl, high blood pressure, was fighting, was eating methamphetamine, had 11 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in his son, and he just said that had nothing to do with his death. Wow. Wow, I can't believe he even said that with a straight face. Zero credibility right now. I would totally write him off as like, you gotta be shitting me, dude. I mean, he could have said it had some, it had a little, it may have had some. He absolutely said all of that meant nothing. Are you freaking kidding me?
Whatsoever.
And again, what was the cause such that those conditions don't matter?
The cause of death is a low level of oxygen that caused the brain damage and caused the heart to stop.
Why did the autopsy doctor, who does this for a living, who is paid by the state, since you waived your fee, why did the doctor paid for by the state say it was the drugs that killed him? Explain that.
You were also asked questions about substances in Mr. Floyd's system. I think you were asked questions about nicotine. Remember that?
Yes.
He didn't die from nicotine, did he? You were asked questions about fentanyl and meth.
Yes.
Any evidence that he died from meth?
No, none.
You were asked questions about whether he had ingested any fentanyl within 5 minutes of his time of death.
Yes.
Now, I think you explained to us that if somebody is suffering from a fentanyl overdose, you would see a depression in the respiratory system.
Yes.
And depression means some reduction in the rate or ability to breathe.
Correct.
Did you see any depression in Mr. Floyd's ability to breathe whatsoever before he went unconscious?
No, absolutely not. He was normal respiratory rate.
Any evidence then that any fentanyl in the system depressed his breathing in any way whatsoever?
No, and that's further borne out in the carbon dioxide.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin. No further
Okay.
questions.
So let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 22. 22 questions is a few questions. I hope the defense comes back on him.
Anything further?
Good. Good.
Two very quick questions. In terms of the carbon dioxide level, you testified that it was at a 96.
Yep. Sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't catch.
You testified that the carbon dioxide was at a 96,
I think it was 89.
89. It was also measured at 102. Did you?
Well, that's the venous one, but not the arterial is the one you need to look at.
And in terms of the ingestion of, or just generally speaking, fentanyl can also cause death as a result of low oxygen to the brain, right?
But it would have to be low through respiratory depression.
Question is,
Yes.
fentanyl
Yes or
can
no?
also cause a death as a result of low oxygen.
Well, your answer is yes, but only in part.
Fair enough, thanks.
Won't just give him a yes.
Briefly.
Just one.
Oh, no, he's coming back.
Mr. Nelson brought up again fentanyl as a cause of death.
Yes.
Doctor, you're familiar with the way people die from fentanyl.
Yes, very.
Do they or do they not go into a coma before they die from a fentanyl overdose?
Yes, they will.
Was Mr. Floyd ever in a coma?
No.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin.
Okay.
Anything else? Thank you. Doctor, thank you so much.
So the defense or the prosecution saying if he didn't go in a coma, he didn't die of fentanyl. So you notice the defense is very good at isolating different causes and not taking combination of fentanyl, meth, struggle, eating drugs, high blood pressure, 90% block. None of those in together or combination. They want to isolate everything individually, which is the total opposite of totality of circumstances. This witness is so far in the tank. He volunteered his time. He wanted to hang this guy. And I mean, he was argumentative, would not answer correctly or specifically to the defense. So this witness really lost credibility. He has great, and I mean, he answered some good questions. He's good at explaining and personalizing things. But man, he gave the defense a hard time. And a lot of people may not see that. All right, we'll end that one there.